Hello and welcome to the Unit 7 Recorded Study Guide. Unit 7 covers the 7 principles of the Constitution, and that is kind of what we will be focusing a lot on during this Recorded Study Guide. But also, we will be looking at the 3 branches of government and how they interact with each other and what kind of powers they do and don't have. But all of those things kind of tie back to the 7 principles of the Constitution, so it's kind of convenient in that way. We start with popular sovereignty. This is going to be found on page 262. And kind of what you need to know about popular sovereignty is it can be broken down into 2 parts, because it's 2 words, obviously. So popular in this case means people, and sovereignty, if you look at it, it has the word reign in it. And if you think about a king or queen reigning over their people, it means that they rule over their people. So sovereignty in this case means right to rule. So if we put those together, we've got the people have the right to rule, represented by this crown. So it's a government in which the people have the right to rule. So the people have the right to rule. That is what popular sovereignty is. Hopefully you can remember that, because we've been talking about it all unit. But you then have to kind of look at, if the people have the right to rule, how do they rule? And what you need to think about with that is, how do rulers, what do rulers do? They make decisions. And how do the people of the United States make decisions? Well, using popular sovereignty, the people rule. They have to make decisions, and in our country they vote, and that's how they make decisions. Now, so by voting, they are ruling over the country. Now, we bring in the second principle of the Constitution, which is on page 262 as well, and that is republicanism. And if the people vote, they vote for what? Most of the time in our country, they are voting for representation, and they are voting for representatives. And because they vote for representatives, we are practicing republicanism as well, because republicanism is a system of government in which people vote for representatives to govern them. So those 2 principles of the Constitution kind of go hand in hand. You have popular sovereignty, where the people have the right to rule. They rule by voting, and in our government we use republicanism as well, so they are voting for representatives. This is the old example that we've used all year long about what a representative is. If we are practicing republicanism in this school, we would, if we were voting on what type of pizza to get, or a question, yes or no, each room would vote for one person, and then they would go up to the office and be our representative. And that's the basic idea of representative. We put both of these principles together in how we elect our president, and that is where you would look at the Electoral College, and that is on page 276. There are 2 parts to being elected president. You have the popular vote, and then you have the Electoral College. If you look at this map, each state is designated a certain amount of electoral votes, and it has to do with population. So the larger states like California have 55, the smaller states, the smaller population anyway, like Idaho has 4. So depending on population is how many electoral votes you get. And what will happen is, in each state, people will vote for who they want to be president, and when the votes are counted up, whoever wins the state gets those electoral votes. So if we look at these 2 maps, we have Missouri and California. Hopefully you can tell the difference between the 2. These are the electoral, or these are the vote results for the 2012 presidential election. If you look at Missouri, you have a lot of red, which would be counties that are represented where Mitt Romney won the vote. And because, if you look at this, a vast majority of the people in Missouri wanted Mitt Romney, or voted for Mitt Romney, that would mean that the electoral votes of Missouri, which are 10, go to Mitt Romney. Now in California, you have the kind of opposite, where you have more people voting for Barack Obama, and he would have won that state, and in California, their 55 votes go to Barack Obama. So the process here is that the people of the state vote for who they want to be president, and then the Electoral College then makes their vote as well. And the vast majority of time, especially in modern times, the Electoral College will always go with who won the popular vote in that state. And if you look at Missouri, a vast amount of people voted for Mitt Romney. But even if it was 50-50, if it was 49% Barack Obama, 51% Mitt Romney would still get all 10 of those Electoral College votes. It's a kind of winner-take-all system. You don't split up the Electoral College votes. So that's kind of how the president is elected. And if you look at it, the people are voting, so they're practicing popular sovereignty, but they are voting on who they want the representatives, or the Electoral College, to vote for. So we're also practicing republicanism. So it's kind of a complicated system, but that's kind of a basic overview. If we move down to the next principle of the Constitution, we are looking at limited government. This is also, again, going to be on 262, and I keep on referencing 262, or it could be on 263 as well. That is where these 7 principles are explained in kind of paragraph form, summary. They give you a basic idea of what's going on. Limited government is basically what we're looking at, is that another way to think of limited government is rule of law. And what they wanted to make, the framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure happened, is that the government couldn't get too powerful, and the people in charge wouldn't abuse their power. So what this really means is that all United States citizens, no matter what position of power you're in, have to follow the rules and have to follow the law. So the example that we talk about in my class, or the few examples that we talk about in my class, is that if I walk into a convenience store, like a gas station, and I just pick up a candy bar and I walk out without paying for it, and the store owner catches me, I'm stealing, and I'm going to face a consequence. If, the senator from Missouri goes into the same gas station, takes the same candy bar, walks out without paying, and the store owner says, hey, you have to pay for that, that is still stealing, and they are going to face the same consequence as I. It's the same deal. No matter how much power you have in our government, you still have to follow the rules. If you walk out on your lawn and this guy's just walking by in front of your house, just minding his own business, walking his dog, and you go up and you shoot him in the face, you're going to go to jail because you just murdered somebody. If the President of the United States walks out on the front lawn in the White House and some guy's just walking his dog, minding his own business on the sidewalk, and the President shoots him in the face, the President's going to jail because he just murdered somebody. It doesn't matter who you are. The fact of the matter is, you've murdered somebody, the President's murdered somebody, the consequence will be the same. And that's what limited government's all about. No one is above the law. Everyone has to follow the same rules. The next principle of the Constitution we look at is federalism. Again, we can look at page 262 and 263 for a lot of a kind of overview summary. And then if you want kind of this chart, the book has this nice and laid out on page 282. Kind of the big kind of key things you need to know for federalism is that its power is shared between the national government and the states. So anytime you see anything that says power is shared or power is divided between the states and the national government, that's what you're talking about federalism. And from there, just kind of look at, what group is responsible for what. The state is going to be responsible for things that concern the state, and the national government is obviously going to be concerned about things that concern the whole nation, like declaring war or sending troops into a foreign country. It wouldn't make much sense if every little state had the power to declare war or make alliances or send troops in. Because if every little state did that, we would have maybe Missouri making alliance with England, and then Illinois making an alliance with Spain, and then if England and Spain get into war, then, the alliances are brought into it, and then Missouri and Illinois are ended up fighting each other. Or if, another example, Arizona for some reason decides that they're just going to declare war on Russia, and all the other states around them are like, no, don't do that. We don't want that to happen. And Russia and Arizona's just like, well, we're going to do it anyway. Well, that endangers the rest of the states. It's not in the best interest of everyone to declare war on Russia. So Arizona's kind of messing things up, and it causes a lot of problems like that. So what we see is, in the system of federalism, the national government has those big overreaching powers that, influence everyone, and the states have things that, have to do with them. And then in the middle are these shared powers or congruent powers, and it means at the same time, and like collecting taxes. The national government and the state government both collect taxes. They can both do those things. But we put this principle of the Constitution into the Constitution because we don't want the national government to have too much power, but we don't want the state governments to have too much power. So what we're going to do is we're just going to share powers. You get some, the states get some, and it balances each other out a little bit. Now, they both can make laws, and they both enforce laws. There's, state police, there's FBI, federal police, things like that. So what you have to think about is, the next thing is, what happens if a state law and a national law come into conflict with one another? Well, if two laws from two separate levels of government are coming into conflict with one another, the higher form of government is always followed. So if a state law conflicts with the national or the federal law always wins because it is the higher authority. So that's something to keep in mind. So with federalism, we have taken this big chunk of power and divided it into these different areas where we have national and state, and then we have the shared powers. With the next principle of the Constitution's separation of powers, we take these powers of the national government, and then we break those apart even more into three sections, which is where we would get the three branches. So when we look at separation of powers, again on page 262, 263, but then also you can see kind of a good chart on 281 that kind of includes some of the checks and balances. But with separation of powers, what we see is we take those national government powers and we divide them into the three branches: legislative, executive, judicial. What you need to understand about each of these is, who is a member of what branch, what is each branch responsible for, and the people who are in each branch, what powers do they have and what powers don't they have. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at in just a second. So legislative branch, they're making the laws. It's Congress, Senate, House of Representatives. The executive branch, they're enforcing or carrying out the laws. That's the president, his cabinet, vice president. Judicial branch, they are interpreting the laws, and that's like the Supreme Court and the judges. And if we look at those kind of in more detail, starting with Congress, we're looking at the powers that are granted to Congress. You need to be looking at page 272 through 274 for these. There is a list of things that Congress can do. And when you look at this, you're thinking about, they can collect taxes, they can declare war, they can do these types of things that are all listed out right there for you. So if you go into those pages and read through that, you will see things like taxes, like they can collect taxes, and they can declare war. And those things are listed out. So just read those, and then you'll have a very good handle on that. The next thing is powers denied to Congress, and this is Article 1, Section 9. This is going to be found on page 274 through 275. It's the same kind of concept. We're going to see a list of things that, Congress can do. And again, when we think about Congress, we are thinking about the legislative branch, and they are making the laws. Important to remember. So back to the powers denied, there's, again, on these pages, things that they cannot do. They can't, they can't put titles of nobility on people like kings or queen. They can't take away habeas corpus, or they can't make ex post facto laws, which we talked about, after the fact laws where they say something's illegal and you did it yesterday. Well, you can't be punished for something that you didn't even know was illegal or wasn't illegal yesterday. Not that you didn't know it, but just that it wasn't illegal. You can't be punished like that. So look over that list of things that they can't do and kind of know a general idea of that kind of stuff. Moving on to powers of the president. This is going to be 277 through 279. Again, this is kind of the same deal. We've got, listed out for you in the Constitution things that the president can do, things that he can't do. When we think about the president, first of all, we're thinking the executive branch, and they are enforcing the laws. The president is making treaties. He's able to pardon people. He can do these things, and all of those are kind of talked about and listed through these pages, 277 to 279. You need to kind of look at those and understand what he can do. Moving on to powers of the Supreme Court. And when we again look at the powers of the Supreme Court, you're looking at, of course, the judges, so judicial branch, and they are interpreting the laws. And another thing that you need to think about is interpret kind of means to decide what they mean or decide if they're unconstitutional or not, and that's kind of the Supreme Court's responsibility. You kind of see how all of these powers work together in the next principle of the Constitution, which would be checks and balances. By the way, the Supreme Court, you're looking at page 280 through 281. So you see how all of these things work together when you look at checks and balances. And checks and balances is explained, as I've said, for a lot of these on 262, 263. But then if you want to see a good chart about what each branch can do to the other to make sure that they're all kind of fair and balanced, that's going to be on 281. So the whole idea of checks and balances is that no one branch of the national government is going to be too powerful. The president can do things to Congress to make sure that Congress isn't gaining too much power, but also Congress can do things to the president to make sure that the president isn't gaining too much power. For example, if we look at this chart, you can see that the president can veto acts of Congress to not make them laws. So that means that if Congress is making a ridiculous law, then that won't happen because the president can veto that thing. But if maybe the president is taking too much power, well, if the president is just acting crazy, the legislative branch, Congress, has a check on him where they can impeach him, which is right here. But if the president is just vetoing everything and just doing stupid stuff, they can override a veto, but it's difficult to do because you have to have 2/3 majority to kind of override that veto, which is a difficult thing to do, but it's something that they can do, and they have a power over the president in that way. The judicial branch can check on both of these by, in both situations, declaring things unconstitutional, using judicial review to declare things unconstitutional. So I would study that chart and know how each branch interacts with each other and what kind of powers the groups have, and 281, it's a good place to look. The last principle of the Constitution that we look at is individual rights, and this is going to be on 262 and 263 for the generic kind of paragraph explanation. And then if you look at the Bill of Rights, they're going to be included on page 286 through 288. And what you need to understand about the individual rights is that they are personal liberties and privileges that all United States citizens have. And the purpose of these is to make sure that the government can't take certain things away from you. And James Madison is writing these, and he's concerned about the wording of some of them, and we've talked about this during the lecture. And what I would focus on is looking at these first 10 amendments and understanding what each one of them says. For example, if you look at the First Amendment on page 286, you are looking at these 5 basic freedoms, speech, religion, assembly, petition, and press. So all of these things are included in the First Amendment. So James Madison wants to make sure that everyone in the whole entire country is able to have access to these rights, and it's written down and it says, hey, the government can't take these things away from you. That's kind of what individual rights is all about. The Fifth Amendment we are going to be looking at on page 287. The Fifth Amendment is the rights of the accused. So the right to remain silent, the Miranda rights. You've probably heard these on TV, like Cops or some movies, like 21 Jump Street. There's a big scene in that movie where he screws up the Miranda rights. But, you have the right not to incriminate yourself, and that's what the Fifth Amendment's all about. Then in that same kind of thought process, the Sixth Amendment is the right to a speedy trial. So you have the right, when you're arrested, you don't have to talk, but then you also have the right that, the Sixth Amendment, that you have access to a speedy trial. They can't just keep you in jail forever. Like if you didn't do it, you shouldn't have to sit in jail for 6 months waiting to prove that you didn't do it. You should be able to have that opportunity very quickly in a public trial in front of a jury. So those are kind of the individual rights that we've talked about. And then how do we make sure that this document can survive the test of time? And that's what we look at when we look at the amendment process. How does it change and flow with what, how the United States changes? This is going to be found on page 283, and there's a really nice chart about, it's kind of like a flow chart. It's got little boxes and arrows, and this kind of looks like a person, so I'm going to finish that. Yeah, all right. But yeah, it's got a nice little, 2/3 majority, and, it explains how amendments are passed. So what you're looking at with the amendments is that as the society changes, like when we want to have women voting, we can add the 19th Amendment by following the amendment process. The Constitution is not a stagnant document. We can add to it if we want to, and 283 kind of walks you through that. The page before that is 282, obviously, and that is going to have Article 4 in it, and that is going to contain your rights of the citizen. And I just kind of read through that. It helps you with a B-level question. It's going to help you on the test to understand how are my rights affected by when I go from Missouri to Illinois, or from Illinois to California. Do they change? Do they stay the same? Like, what's the process here? If I'm a citizen of Missouri, do I have to worry about losing all of my rights if I go to Florida? If you read through Article 4 and the rights of the citizens, you'll have the answers to those questions. All right, so that is kind of everything that's covered on the study guide. Let's move on quickly to talk a little bit about your B-level questions. As always, we have kind of touched on a lot of the B-level questions already, but just to kind of shoot through them just a little bit, just to give you a idea of what we're talking about. How do people of the United States have a voice in the government and policy and procedure? Basically, what this question is asking you is, how do people participate in our government, and how do the people rule? And if you use the principles of the Constitution, you know that the people rule by voting with popular sovereignty, and then they vote for representatives to govern them. And that is how people participate, and that's how people have a voice. They have a voice by voting. How do we encourage democracy and fulfill our duties when we fulfill our duties and responsibility as United States citizens? This is on page 303. There's a Venn diagram that has the responsibilities of a United States citizen. You need to look at those and think, if I don't do these things, or if people don't do these things like voting, how does that hurt our government? When everybody votes, how does that help our government? When no one serves in the military, how does that hurt us? Why might a Supreme Court justice feel less political pressure than a congressman or a woman in making judgments about the Constitution? This would be on page 268, and there's a chart that shows you the term limits, or the terms of Congress, Senator, President, and Supreme Court. You will notice that if you're in Congress, you have a term limit, like it's 2 or 6 years, and at the end of that, you have to get reelected. That's what political pressure is. It's that pressure that you feel about, like, oh man, if I don't do things right, if I don't do things that people like, I'm not going to get reelected. I'm going to lose my job. A Supreme Court justice doesn't have to worry about that. They serve for life, and they don't have to worry about getting reelected, so they don't have that type of pressure. So that's what you need to think about. How is our president elected? How does this principle support, or how does this support the principles of the Constitution? That would be the Electoral College, and we just talked about that, so hopefully you remember it. What do you think is the purpose of dividing power between national and state governments? Well, we don't want the national government to get too powerful. We don't want the state governments to get too powerful. We don't want the states to have powers that don't make any sense for them to have, like declaring war. And we don't want the national government to mess around with little stuff like fire protection, like having a fire station in Washington. The Washington, D.C. shouldn't have to worry about fire protection in Washington, Missouri. Why are checks and balances important to how government functions? I mean, it's just plain and simple, so one part of the government doesn't get too powerful. Why do you think more votes are needed to ratify an amendment than to propose one? Ratify, again, means to approve an amendment. So if you are ratifying an amendment, it is going into law. It is official. Proposing means that you're just kind of talking about it, or you are going to think about doing this thing. So why are more votes needed to approve it, make it a law, than to just kind of discuss it? How does the Constitution reflect a fear of too strong of a national government? I mean, it's all over. Popular sovereignty, republicanism, federalism, limited government, it's a big one. Individual rights, checks and balances. They divide the powers and make sure no one part gets too much. They put in things that say everybody has to follow the rules. They put in things that say, these are our rights. It's all over the Constitution. How do we add amendments to the Constitution, and what is the purpose of adding amendments? I'll move this. Amending the Constitution. I showed you the chart. Well, I kind of started drawing a chart and then I drew a face. But that is on page 283, and you can see how we do that. And then you need to think about, why do we add things? I mean, as society changes, is there a need to improve the Constitution? That's what you kind of need to think about. So, that is Unit 7. That's your test. There will be an online study session Thursday, which is today because we're all watching it in class today. It is going to start at 7:30. Get online, ask some questions, talk about some stuff if you have any. And, so good luck studying. Everything will be fine if you just, look over your study guide and took good notes. And if you want to watch this again, that would really help. So good luck.